She was just 6 when her stepmother yanked her onto that splintered platform they dared to call a stage. Right beside her, her twin sister stood trembling, silent, far too young to grasp the terrible cost being placed on their lives. No one in the crowd made a move. No one even breathed. Until one man, carrying nothing but his name and the weight of a broken heart, stepped out from the shadows and rewrote everything. Before we dive in, if you're the kind of person who's moved by stories of quiet bravery, unlikely love, and the everyday miracles hiding in plain sight, you might want to hit subscribe. That single click helps us keep telling real stories that matter, and we're truly grateful to have you here. Let's begin. The auction barn, present day. The old barn still held the ghost of manure in the air, though no livestock had stood there in years. Dust floated lazily in beams of sunlight that sliced through the warped wooden roof. Rusty cattle gates had been shoved aside to form a crude stage. And tonight, like every final Saturday of the month, it wasn't livestock they were selling. It was people. Mostly children. Near the back of the barn, Gabe Whitaker stood quietly, shoulders slightly hunched beneath a worn denim shirt. The collar was turned up, not against the cold, but out of habit. At his side stood his 10-year-old son, Theo, who clung to his hand with quiet confidence. The boy's eyes, cloudy from blindness, saw nothing, and his hearing wasn't sharp either. Gabe had to lean in, speaking slowly and clearly into his left ear just to be understood. But tonight, Theo stayed silent. And that silence? It pressed the heaviest against Gabe's heart. The girls appear. He had no business being there. Every instinct in him screamed to take Theo and walk away. Before the stink of hopelessness sank into his bones the way it had clung to everyone else in the room. Then he saw them. 2 little girls, 6, maybe 7, shoved into the light. Bruised. Barefoot. Identical in pain, but not in spirit. One stood her ground, spine straight even as her hands shook. The other clung tightly to her sister's sleeve, lip trembling like a leaf caught in a storm. Behind them, a woman appeared, skeletal, sharp-eyed, and stinking of cheap gin. She yanked them forward and threw them into view like scraps. 2 for 1, she sneered, waving a cigarette carelessly. They're good girls. Know how to wash, cook, stay quiet. I raised them right. Bidding starts at 200. A low murmur spread through the crowd like a bad draft. Men shifted in place. A woman in a faded church coat gripped her handbag a little tighter. Something icy crept into Gabe's gut. The way those girls didn't even flinch at the shouting. That was what cut the deepest. They were used to it. He glanced at Theo. The boy tilted his head slightly, picking up on the tension, though he couldn't see a thing. No takers? The woman barked. Fine. 150. They'll pull their weight. They know what fear is. And they don't cry anymore. That's worth something. Gabe's jaw clenched. This wasn't what he came for. He had only shown up to drop off a busted radiator, maybe make a few bucks on scrap. But something in the older girl's eyes. Something in the way she wrapped herself protectively around her sister. It hooked him. Held him. Refused to let him look away. 78, Gabe said aloud, almost surprised to hear his own voice. And 3 cents. Heads turned. What did you say? The woman squinted down from the stage. That's what I've got, he said evenly. If you want them with someone who won't hurt them, someone who'll feed them and give them a place to sleep, then that's all I can offer. The air shifted. The silence was thick, heavy with disbelief. The stepmother scoffed. 78 bucks? For 2 mouths to feed. I'm not buying mouths, Gabe said, voice steady and low. I'm offering a home. He stepped forward, pulled out his wallet, edges cracked, leather worn soft from years of use. The coins clinked louder than expected in the hushed space. Then, from the shadows at the back of the barn, a voice rose. It was a woman's voice. Smooth, controlled, undeniably sure of itself. I'll cover the rest, she said. Everyone turned. At the top of the old stairs stood a tall woman in a long coat. Her face was half hidden beneath the brim of a wide hat. She held out a slim envelope and handed it to the auctioneer. No one seemed to know who she was. No one dared to ask. The stepmother's eyes lit up with greed. Gabe turned to see the woman, but she was already walking away, boots echoing across the wooden floor. She never once looked back. Leaving the auction, Gabe turned to the girls. "Can you walk?" he asked. The older one gave a small nod. "I'm Gabe. This is Theo," he told them gently. "You're safe now, okay?" They didn't say a word, but the way they climbed off that stage, hands clenched together like a lifeline, was answer enough. They rode home in Gabe's rust-covered pickup, under a sky just beginning to snow. Theo sat up front. Gabe wrapped each girl in one of the only 2 spare jackets he owned. Both carried the faint scent of diesel and sawdust. Neither of the girls spoke. Eventually, the younger one drifted off, her head resting on her sister's shoulder. The older girl just stared out the window, like her body had left the platform, but her mind was still stuck on it. "What are your names?" Gabe asked quietly. A long pause. "Isla," she whispered at last. "She's Ruby." "Beautiful names," Gabe said softly. "Are you girls hungry?" They didn't answer, but sometimes silence says everything. Arrival at the cabin. When they pulled up to the cabin, just 2 small rooms, a stove that coughed on cold mornings, and a fireplace that rarely burned past a flicker. Gabe unlocked the door and flicked on the overhead light. "Go ahead," he said. "Welcome home." The living room was humble, a little beat up, but it was clean. Theo's books were stacked neatly on the old coffee table, labeled in braille and held together with rubber bands. Isla looked around cautiously, her eyes scanning every corner. She didn't trust it. Maybe she couldn't. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the pull-out couch like she wasn't sure it would stay solid. "You can sleep here tonight," Gabe told her, nodding to the couch. "Blankets are fresh. I'll fix something warm." Still, she didn't move, so he knelt beside her, voice soft. "You don't owe me anything," he said. "You're just home now. That's all." Something flickered behind her guarded expression. Not trust, but maybe the faint memory of it. The next morning, the morning crept in slowly, slipping through frost-edged windows like it wasn't sure it belonged. The old stove groaned twice before finally catching flame. Gabe stirred from the recliner, his back aching. The blanket half slid to the floor. He sat there for a moment, just listening. Silence, but not the empty kind. This was the kind filled with gentle breath, and the smallest, most fragile thing of all, hope. He stepped over the worn rug and peeked into the living room. Waking together a new morning, Isla and Ruby lay curled up on the pull-out couch, wrapped tightly in blankets from head to toe. Only Ruby's small hand peeked out, still gripping a fistful of her sister's shirt as she slept. Across the room, Theo was already awake. He sat cross-legged on the braided rug, one hand resting on his talking storybook. The batteries had long since died, but he turned the pages anyway, his fingers gliding over the raised lines like they still told him stories. Gabe knelt down beside him. "Morning, buddy," he whispered. "Sleep all right?" Theo turned his head slightly and gave a small nod. "We've got company now. The girls, remember?" Another nod, quicker this time. "They're going to be with us for a while. We help them, they help us. That okay with you?" Theo reached out and took his father's hand. That quiet gesture was all Gabe needed. Breakfast and the tap code. In the kitchen, Gabe stirred a pot of oatmeal. He added a splash of canned milk and a spoonful of brown sugar he'd been saving for a holiday that never came. Then he set the table. 4 chipped bowls, for mismatched spoons, and 4 dented tin cups filled with lukewarm water. He stopped, stared at the empty chair, then turned around and added one more setting. When the girls finally woke, Isla was the first to move. She gently brushed the hair out of Ruby's eyes and helped her sit up, guiding her with the calm assurance of someone who'd already learned how cruel the world could be and had decided to shield someone smaller from it. "Morning," Gabe said softly. "Oatmeal's ready." Ruby gave the bowl a suspicious glance. "We don't gotta clean something for it first?" "No," Gabe replied, his voice calm. Isla narrowed her eyes at the mismatched utensils. "They match." Gabe chuckled under his breath. "Not even close." Theo was already seated, hands hovering just above his bowl as if he could sense the warmth rising from it. "Come on," Gabe said, motioning toward the table. "Let's eat." All 5 of them sat down. For the first time in 6 years, every seat at the table was filled. Not since his wife had passed, back when Theo was still a baby, had that happened. Those extra chairs had been pushed aside long ago. Gathering dust and unopened mail? Their purpose forgotten. Now they were filled with elbows nudging, glances exchanged over oatmeal. A clumsy, fragile kind of togetherness. Not loud, but undeniably alive. Halfway through breakfast, Theo stretched out his hand and tapped the table twice, then 3 times. Isla noticed first. "He's counting," she said gently. Gabe looked up, surprised. "You understood that?" "Yeah. That's how we used to talk," she said, her voice soft but sure. "When it was dark. 1 tap for yes. 2 for no. 3 for I don't know." Gabe blinked. "You made that up?" She nodded slowly. "It was the only way to talk when she locked us in the closet." A silence fell, quiet and heavy like fresh snow. Gabe set his spoon down. "Well then, maybe we keep using it," he said. "Might come in handy." Theo smiled. Faint but real. A flicker of light beginning to stretch. Chores in small shifts. After breakfast, the kids got to work on their own, no instructions needed. Isla wiped the counters clean. Ruby grabbed the broom and swept without being asked. And Theo, inspired by the quiet momentum of his new housemates, tapped once, asking if he could help bring in firewood. They worked like kids who'd grown up surviving, not just living. No complaints. No dragging feet. Just purposeful movement and the occasional glance like they were still waiting for consequences that never came. Gabe leaned in the doorway and watched them, heart twisting at the sight. Later that day, he pulled an old box of blankets down from the closet and found one decorated with faded butterflies. He laid it gently at the end of the girl's makeshift bed. "Haven't seen this in years," he murmured. "It was my wife's favorite." Isla stared at the blanket in silence. Then, with great care, she folded it over Ruby's shoulders before crawling in beside her. By the fire, a quiet night. That night, Gabe sat beside the fire. Theo leaned against him, head resting in the crook of his arm. The girls were nearby, lying close, whispering softly in a language that only twins seemed to understand. Half-formed words, murmured breaths, so rhythmic they sounded more like a lullaby than conversation. Later, long after the fire had faded to embers, Gabe lay awake, staring at the ceiling. 5 plates on a table. 3 children under one roof. And a stranger in a coat who'd vanished without a name. He didn't know where this path led. Didn't know if he'd be able to cover next week, let alone next year. But deep beneath the ache of loss and the grind of survival, something in him settled. Not perfect, not painless, but solid. And in a world like this, solid felt close to a miracle. The days that followed, the days that came after, fell into place like soft snowfall. Gentle, hesitant, but beautiful all the same. Nothing moved fast in the Whitaker cabin. But little by little, everything was shifting. Gabe noticed it first in the silence. Not the kind that suffocates. The other kind, the kind filled with subtle sounds of life returning. Whispers traded between bunk beds. Pages turning in borrowed books. The padding of bare feet across wood floors. Tugging on hand-me-downs far too big for their shoulders. Healing has a sound. and it rarely shouts. Theo began sitting closer to the girls during meals, head tilted, as if he could hear better through the quiet closeness. One night, Gabe watched in awe as Theo reached out and gently tapped the side of Isla's bowl 3 times. "I don't know," Isla said, grinning. "That's what it means, right?" Theo nodded. "Then 1 tap." "Yes." Ruby giggled. The sound was so rare that Gabe nearly dropped his fork. 4th morning, Isla and the axe. By the 4th morning, the snow had begun to melt. Sunlight slipped between the pines in golden strands, warming the frost-covered world just enough to remind them spring was coming. Gabe stepped out onto the porch with his axe in hand, ready to split wood for the day. And there she was. Isla sat cross-legged at the top step, her breath fogging in the cold air. "You always up this early?" Gabe asked, pausing beside her. She shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." He stood there a beat. "Bad dreams?" She didn't respond, just stared out at the trees. Then, after a long pause, she turned her head slightly. "Why did you buy us?" The porch conversation, why Gabe stayed. Gabe slowly lowered the axe to the porch. "I didn't buy you," he said softly. "I gave everything I had just to get you away from her." Isla's gaze lifted, sharp and skeptical. "But why? You didn't even know us." Gabe let out a quiet sigh and leaned the axe gently against the railing. "Theo was around your age when his mom passed away," he said. "And I still remember the moment I saw that light leave his eyes. I've seen that look before when a kid stops believing anyone's coming." She stared at him for a long beat, reading him, trying to find a crack in his voice, a flicker of dishonesty in his eyes. But there was nothing to find. Ruby scraped knee. Isla steps in. Later that afternoon, Ruby caught her foot on the rug near the stove and took a tumble, scraping her knee. It wasn't anything major, just a bit of blood. But the sharp little cry that left her lips caught Gabe off guard. She usually seemed too tough for that. He crouched beside her, inspecting the scrape. "All right, little soldier," he said gently. "Let's patch you up." But before he could even stand, Isla appeared at his side. A damp cloth in one hand, the first aid kit already open in the other. "Wait," she said quietly. "I'll take care of it." She pressed the cloth to her sister's knee, careful and steady. Then dabbed the blood away, blew on the sting to soothe it, and applied ointment before covering it with a bandage. "She's better with cuts than anyone," Ruby sniffled, trying to smile. Gabe raised an eyebrow. "How do you know all that?" Isla kept her eyes on the bandage. "I used to watch the nurses every time she hit us hard enough to send us to the ER. Her voice was flat, calm. No drama, no emotion. But her hands never wavered once. A stranger's gift, the envelope. That night, after the kids had drifted off to sleep, Gabe stood at the window watching the snow fall again. Soft at first, then thick, covering the porch like a secret. His thoughts kept circling back to her. The woman from the auction. Graceful, quiet, gone before anyone could ask her name. Earlier that morning, someone had left an envelope in the mailbox. No return address. No handwriting Gabe recognized. Inside was a crisp $100 bill and a note written in perfect cursive. "Keep going. You're doing better than you think." He stared at it for a long time, wondering, who was she? Why him? But those were questions for another time. Tonight, 3 kids were tucked in under his roof, and the steady sound of Theo breathing in the next room was all the answer Gabe really needed. The library trip, new pages. A week later, Gabe loaded the kids into his truck and drove to the edge of town for a short trip. Their first official outing as a group. The destination, the county library. He didn't know how folks would react. 3 children, clearly not siblings, walking in together with a quiet man who didn't explain much. Still, he hoped that time and maybe kindness could ease any raised eyebrows. Miss Ada, the librarian, a warm-eyed widow with silver curls and a voice like chamomile, welcomed them with a soft smile. "You're the man who took those girls in," she whispered as she scanned the library cards. "God bless your heart." Gabe didn't correct her. In the children's section, Ruby found the audiobook shelf and lit up like sunrise. She bounced over to Theo, dragging him by the hand to share her discovery. Meanwhile, Isla wandered off, slow and curious. She paused in front of the human anatomy shelf, trailing her fingers along the spines of thick textbooks. "I want to know how it all works," she said, barely above a whisper. Gabe knelt beside her. "You mean your body?" "No," she said. "I mean how to fix people." He smiled softly. "Well, this is a good place to start." They left with 5 books, 3 kids smiling, and something else Gabe hadn't expected it. A quiet sense that something in their story had started moving again. Like a clock that had sat frozen for years had finally ticked once more. Theo's tap, a revelation. That night, as Gabe tucked Theo into bed, the boy tapped softly against the mattress. One pause. Another. Then one tap. Then again. "Yes. Yes. Yes." Gabe tilted his head. "What are you saying, kiddo?" Theo turned toward him. His pale eyes, usually distant, were wide, alert. Clearer than Gabe had ever seen them. "She helps," he whispered. "She makes me hear." Gabe froze. "You mean Ruby?" Theo shook his head gently. "Isla." Gabe's breath caught in his chest. Something unspoken rising like steam from the center of his being. Theo had never spoken that clearly before. He'd never said a name. "How does she help?" Gabe asked quietly. Theo tapped his own palm. "She touches my hand. And I just know what's real. By the fire, a kind of hope." That night, Gabe sat by the fire once more. His knees ached, but his chest, his heart felt full. He glanced around the room. Drawings taped to the fridge. Boots lined up by the door, still muddy. The peaceful, sleeping breath of 3 children drifting in from down the hall. He had nothing in his bank account. No firm plan for tomorrow. No safety net. But what he did have was this. A boy who finally spoke. A girl who wanted to heal. And another who laughed like sunlight breaking through clouds. And out there somewhere, a stranger who kept showing up in the quietest, most unexpected ways. He didn't know what came next. But for the first time in years, he didn't dread the morning. And as he pulled the blanket over his lap, he realized, that's what hope sounds like. The storm comes, and so does resolve. The first true storm of December didn't ease its way in. It arrived like an uninvited guest. All fury and ice, howling through the hills and snapping through pine trees like twigs. It didn't knock. It slammed. Gabe had seen his share of winters up here in the Nevada mountains. But this one came early, and it came hard. He was on the roof before dawn, hammer in hand, trying to secure a sheet of tin that had come loose in the wind, flapping like the wing of something broken. He should have fixed it last spring, but should have never covered groceries, or shoes, or firewood. So, like always, he held it together one nail at a time. The roof. The walls. The life. Inside the cabin. The light inside the cabin was dim and unsteady. The power had flickered out twice already, and even on a good day, the heat was hit or miss. Still, the kids moved around like they'd been there forever, working in quiet coordination that no one had ever taught them. Isla quietly gathered firewood from the stack near the hearth. Ruby folded the laundry Gabe had left to dry near the stove. Theo sat cross-legged by the window, listening as the wind threaded its way through the cabin's cracks, humming like a worn-out lullaby. Not one of them complained. Not once. The cut and the shift. By noon, the storm hit its full fury. The walls creaked under the pressure. The power went out completely. And Gabe came back inside, soaked to the bone, limping. A jagged scrape on his forearm bleeding from where a stray nail had caught him. He hadn't even noticed it until Isla gasped. "You're bleeding." "It's fine," he muttered, brushing snow off his shoulders. Roof still up, but Isla was already moving. At the sink, she wet a cloth and pulled down the first aid kit with the same calm focus she'd shown the day Ruby scraped her knee. "Sit," she said, firm, no hesitation. Gabe did, more stunned by the authority in her voice than the sting in his arm. She cleaned the cut with practiced hands, blew gently across the wound to cool the burn, and wrapped it tighter than he would have bothered doing himself. Then she looked up at him, not with the eyes of a child seeking approval, but with the gaze of someone who had known pain too early. And too well. You can't keep doing it all alone, she said, quiet but certain. Gabe let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Long, heavy. Somebody's got to, he replied. Isla tilted her head slightly. Not if somebody's already helping. Holding it together. By the middle of the afternoon, the cold had crept into everything. The storm was still raging, and Gabe could feel tension building in the floorboards. That tight, invisible pressure that comes right before silence gives way to fear. So he lit every candle he could find, even the cinnamon-scented one his wife had bought years ago. The one he'd never had the heart to use. Until now. He filled a pot with water, tossed in whatever was left in the pantry, some potatoes, a handful of lentils, and the last of the carrots, and stirred it slowly over the fire. It smells like soup, Ruby said, sounding hopeful. Almost, Gabe replied with a small smile. She leaned her head against his arm. You're really good at pretending everything's okay. He glanced sideways at her. That easy to read, huh? She smirked. Only if you've done it too. Soup, cards, and courage. They ate their makeshift soup sitting on the floor near the fire. Bowls cupped in cold, tired hands. Spoons clinking softly against ceramic. It felt like more than just a meal. It felt like something sacred. 5 people, drawn close. Steam rising into the candlelight like smoke from a prayer. Theo reached for a second helping. Gabe pretended he didn't wipe a tear with the back of his hand. After dinner, Ruby rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a worn deck of cards. She taught Theo how to sort them by touch. He couldn't see the suits or numbers, but she let him guess anyway. Counting edges, feeling the textures. The club feels like a paw, he said, running his fingers over it. And hearts. Ruby teased. They're for girls. Boys have hearts too, Theo shot back almost defiantly. Gabe turned to the fireplace, hiding the grin creeping onto his face. He didn't know where his son had picked up something so wise, but he was glad it lived in him now. Isla's dream. Off to the side, Isla sat quietly, thumbing through one of the anatomy books she'd checked out from the library. She paused at a diagram of the human ear, tracing its shape with slow, careful fingers. Like she was trying to reassemble the pieces inside Theo. You think I'll ever fix it? She whispered to no one in particular. Gabe looked over, catching her words. You're already fixing more than you realize, he said gently. The storm breaks. The wind finally settled sometime after midnight. The power didn't come back. But Gabe found an old battery-powered radio in the back closet and fiddled with the dial until he caught the low hum of a weather report. Black ice across the highway. Power outages stretching over 4 counties. Schools closed for the week, and no one coming up that road anytime soon. So they leaned into it. They built forts from couch cushions and blankets. Made up stories by firelight. Gabe taught them how to read animal tracks in the snow. How to use a compass. And how not to burn oatmeal. And in return, the children taught him how to smile without flinching. How to laugh without apology. How to see his cabin not as a shelter that had seen too much, but as a home still capable of holding more. A gift in the woodpile. 3 days later, the storm began to lift. Sunlight cracked through the trees, gold against the snow. And that morning, tucked quietly into the woodpile, Gabe found something unexpected. No tracks in the snow. No note on the door. Just a brown paper package like it had bloomed there overnight. Inside, a new winter coat for Isla, fleece-lined boots just Ruby's size, and a braille watch for Theo. Each item came with a tiny note written in the same elegant handwriting as the first. For those who walk through storms with open hearts. No name, no sender, just that quiet grace. Gabe held the note in his hands for a long time, fingers brushing over the ink, afraid it might vanish like a dream. Then he smiled, small but certain. and slipped it into the drawer where he kept all the other miracles. Late January, the thaw begins. The thaw didn't announce itself. It arrived quietly, like most good things do. One morning in late January, the thick blanket of snow atop the tin roof gave way all at once. Sliding off in a wet, heavy rush, it hit the yard below with a thud. Soft and solid. And just like that, winter began to loosen its grip. A drip and a cup of coffee. Outside the kitchen window, a single drop of water began to fall. Slow, steady, measured like the ticking of a clock just coming back to life. Gabe watched it as he sipped from his chipped mug, shoulders wrapped in a flannel shirt that had seen better years. The scent of wood smoke clung to everything these days. In the fabric, the floorboards, even his hair. But he didn't mind it. That smell meant warmth. It meant they'd made it through another storm. Letters and laughter. Behind him, the twins were seated cross-legged on the floor with Theo between them. He was tracing raised letters with his fingers across the surface of a flattened cereal box one Isla had carefully labeled using thick strokes of black marker. D, Isla said with quiet focus. Like doctor. Theo nodded, letting his fingers follow the shape of the letter. Or D like danger, or donuts, or dad, Ruby chimed in, flashing a mischievous grin at Gabe. That covers quite a bit, he said with a small laugh. Life covers quite a bit, Ruby replied, dead serious, as if she'd just quoted something sacred. Gabe raised an eyebrow. Can't argue with that. Curiosity in the bookshop. Later that afternoon, Gabe took a short drive into town to fix a leaking pipe in Miss Ada's bookshop. Isla rode along in the passenger seat, asking question after question the whole way. She didn't just want answers. She wanted understanding. Every word she absorbed felt like a piece of something she was quietly assembling. Why does a pipe hiss before it bursts? She asked, brows knit in thought. Because the air squeezes through before the water gets there, Gabe explained. It's a warning if you're paying attention. Isla turned it over for a moment. So, people hiss too? Gabe glanced at her, puzzled. What do you mean? When people are about to break, she said softly. They hiss first. They say sharp things. Then they cry. Gabe didn't have an answer. She was 6, maybe 7, but she saw more than most adults ever let themselves see. The pup in the fence. After the job, Miss Ada treated them to cocoa and oatmeal cookies. They were still enjoying them when a sharp, frantic yelp echoed from outside. A high, panicked sound that made everyone freeze. They rushed out to find a golden retriever pup tangled in the neighbor's wire fence, a shallow cut bleeding just above its paw. The neighbor hovered nearby, looking flustered and unsure. I'll call animal control, he muttered, reaching for his phone. But Isla was already kneeling beside the dog, whispering gently under her breath. No need, she said calmly. I can help. Gabe knelt next to her. You sure about that? She nodded, eyes fixed on the pup. He's scared. Not dangerous. She tore a strip from the bottom of her shirt, pressed it gently to the wound, and then, using a twig and a second piece of fabric, fashioned a makeshift splint. And all the while, she hummed. Not a lullaby exactly. Something quieter, steadier. She said her mother used to hum that tune when they were small. It wasn't meant to send someone to sleep. It was meant to say, you're safe now. The pup stopped trembling. Miss Ada, standing just behind Gabe, leaned in and whispered, that child's got healer's hands. Gabe didn't say a word, but something deep in his chest, something buried beneath grief and years of silence, settled. It wasn't just pride. It was reverence. The sketch. That evening, Isla curled up near the fire with one of Theo's old notebooks. She didn't speak. She just drew. When she finally held the page up, it showed a careful sketch of the dog's injured leg. Bones, muscles, even the wound site, labeled as best she could manage. Gabe blinked. You remembered all that? Just from reading. Isla gave a small nod. I want to fix people, she said simply. Theo, who'd been sitting nearby, reached over. He tapped the paper once. Gabe smiled. "You're already doing that," he said. "More than you know." The box on the porch. The next morning a box appeared. No knock. No footsteps in the snow. No sign of a delivery truck. Just a small cardboard package, wrapped in brown paper, sitting like it had been placed there by the wind. Inside were three things: a child-sized stethoscope, brand new, a crisp white coat, small enough to fit Isla, and a book titled Healing Hands, The Beginner's Guide to Medical Curiosity. Tucked inside the tissue paper was a note, written in that same familiar, elegant handwriting, for the girl who already understands what many grown-ups forget, that healing begins with care, not credentials. Gabe stood on the porch for a long time, the note resting in his hand, the cold quiet of the mountains surrounding him, snowmelt dripping gently from the eaves. Whoever had sent it wasn't watching from behind a camera, or from a shadowed window. No, they were watching with something else entirely, a heart that recognized when something rare was worth watering. Gabe looked up at the sky. "Thank you," he whispered. The white coat. When Isla opened the package and lifted the coat out, she didn't squeal. She didn't bounce. She didn't even smile. She simply slipped it on, one button at a time, careful, focused, as if she'd been expecting it all along. Then she stood up a little straighter. "Do I look like a doctor?" she asked. Theo raised his hand without hesitation and gave her a thumbs up, solid and proud. Gabe's voice was steady when he said, "You look like you were born to be one." Isla gave a solemn nod. "Good," she said. "Then I better keep going." Ruby's voice, that night, that evening, Ruby curled against Gabe on the worn old couch while Theo gently traced letters on her arm with his fingers. "Do you really think Isla's going to be a doctor one day?" she asked. "Honestly," Gabe said, "I think she already is." Ruby grinned. "I want to be something too. Something big." "You already are." She shook her head. "No, I mean something loud. Something that answers back. Something the world can't ignore." Gabe thought about the way she spoke in the mornings, how she translated Theo's taps without hesitation, how she walked around like a firework wrapped in a little girl's frame, ready to burst if the world got too quiet. He nodded. "You'll figure it out." And in his chest he already knew. One child would mend the world with her hands, the other with her words. Both of them were miracles, unfolding right in front of him. First day, a different kind of brave. By the time February rolled in, most of the snow had melted, leaving the ground soggy with mud and scattered pine needles. Sidewalks in town were slick with thawed ice and stained with salt, and the small school building, square and leaning slightly, looked like it had survived more winters than kids. It was Ruby's first day of school. Isla had started 2 weeks earlier and already found her rhythm, quickly becoming the soft-spoken, sharp-eyed girl every teacher quietly rooted for. But Ruby was a different song altogether. That morning, Gabe had asked her 5 separate times if she was nervous. Each time she answered the same way, with a shrug, a smirk, and a hand adjusting the blue hairband holding her curls back. "Not nervous," she said. "I'm watching." "Watching what exactly?" Gabe asked. "To see who needs someone to say the stuff they can't." He chuckled, shaking his head. "You're 6. Almost 7, she corrected, stepping out of the truck like she was taking center stage. And in a way she was. Ruby stands up. By lunchtime, Ruby had already made an impression. But not in the way Gabe had quietly feared. It happened in the cafeteria. A small, jumpy boy in her class dropped his tray near a group of older kids. They laughed as he fumbled to pick everything up, his face red and eyes wide. "You're such a spaz," one of them sneered. "What, your mom still feed you with a baby spoon?" The room fell into that heavy silence everyone knows, eh? The kind where cruelty echoes louder because no one says a thing. Except Ruby. She stood up loud and sure, her chair scraping against the floor. "That's not funny," she said, her voice cutting clean through the noise. The older boys turned. The small boy froze. Ruby didn't flinch. She took a step forward. "What's so funny about someone being scared or needing help?" The ringleader rolled his eyes. "Mind your business, orphan." Ruby stared him down. "People like him are my business." Then she raised her voice, clear, strong, and meant for everyone to hear. "I used to hide under a bed because my mom's sister said I was too noisy to live in the house. But someone helped me. Someone who didn't have to. So now I know what it feels like when nobody speaks up." The cafeteria froze. Then a clap. Then another. Then more. The boy with the tray looked at her like she'd just struck a match in the dark. Ruby sat back down and kept eating her peanut butter sandwich like nothing had happened. The call from the school. That afternoon, the school called. Gabe picked up, bracing himself for trouble. But on the other end of the line, the principal, Mrs. Whitaker, sounded more stunned than concerned. "Mr. Whitaker, I just wanted to say thank you." For what?" "For raising a 6-year-old civil rights leader." The dinner table, retelling the moment. That evening, Ruby retold the whole story at dinner like she was describing a hopscotch game. Isla blinked at her from across the table. "You talked back to a 5th grader?" "He was a jerk," Ruby replied, casually shoveling mashed potatoes into her mouth. Theo smiled and tapped the table once. "Yes." Gabe leaned back in his chair, eyes resting on the smallest girl at the table. Not as by blood, but every bit as by bond. She was finding her fire. And that fire? It was already lighting up everyone around her. The envelope, a new path. A week later, a new envelope showed up. No name. No handwriting. Just a small, cream-colored card tucked inside, embossed in gold. "The world needs more voices like hers. Consider this a beginning." Inside was a scholarship application for a junior leadership and speech summer camp, held at a private university 3 hours away. Everything paid for. Every last expense covered. Gabe nearly dropped it. "Someone's watching again," he murmured. Ruby didn't even blink. "Good," she said. "I want them to see. Spring, growth in the quiet places." As spring edged its way in, the children bloomed in their own quiet, determined ways. Isla, now wearing her white coat like it had always belonged to her, spent long afternoons sketching diagrams of hearts and organs. Reading aloud to Theo about bones and blood, turning the pages slowly so he could trace every line. Ruby wrote essays even when no one asked for them. Her newest, "Why Every Kid Deserves a Second Try." Mrs. Whitaker pinned it up on the school bulletin board for everyone to read. And Theo? He listened. He traced. He smiled more than he used to. New language, Theo's awakening. The shift started small but unmistakably. Parents around town began to take notice. And Theo, once so quiet it hurt to listen, started reaching out in his own way. Not with spoken words, but with taps, motions, and careful touches that said more than full sentences ever could. Bit by bit, his world was expanding, opening up like morning light through closed blinds. And it was his sisters, one with fire, the other with stillness, who refused to let him drift into silence again. Gabe watched them in the evenings, not to keep them in line, not out of obligation, but because witnessing them grow felt like watching sunlight spill across land you once believed was barren. Unanswered questions, and the name Margot. And yet, even in the midst of all this fragile beauty, questions still lingered in the back of Gabe's mind. Mostly about Margot. about what it meant to be lifted up by someone whose face he hadn't seen since the barn. Someone who had given so much without asking for anything in return. He wondered if all of this second life they were building, came with a cost he hadn't seen yet. He tucked the envelope with Ruby's scholarship application into the same drawer as the others. The drawer of quiet miracles. He didn't know where this path would lead. But when he looked at Ruby, fierce as thunder, at Isla, steady as falling rain, or at Theo, turning toward the wind like he could feel it again, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He wouldn't give this life back for anything. That night, as the fire flickered low and the house settled into the hush of sleep, Gabe stepped out onto the porch. Wrapped in a blanket, he looked up at a sky full of stars and breathed in the silence. Somewhere out there, he could feel it. The woman from the auction was still watching. Not as a nameless donor, not even as a stranger, but as something far more layered, something deeper, something personal. The hidden receipt, a clue appears. It all started with a folded receipt. Gabe found it tucked between the pages of Theo's favorite Braille storybook, probably slipped there by curious little fingers during quiet time. At first glance, he figured it was just another scrap from one of the anonymous donation boxes that had appeared on the porch now and then. But this one was different. Typed across the top were the words, Second Light Foundation Disbursement Office. And beneath that, written in precise, elegant cursive, V. Vale. Gabe froze. Vale. He'd seen that name before, barely visible at the bottom of an article he'd half-read months ago. A story about a tech mogul who'd dropped out of the public eye, an orphan herself who'd turned her fortune into quiet philanthropy. And Second Light, that name had been whispered once in a town council meeting, linked to a fund that discreetly wiped out school lunch debt across multiple counties. He stared at the receipt. His hands had gone cold. He hadn't been searching for answers, but maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop avoiding them. The drive north, searching for Margot. The next morning, Gabe packed a small bag and warmed up the truck. He left the kids with Miss Ada, who had long since become more than just a friendly librarian. She was family now, the kind you collect after loss. Then he headed north. The city greeted him with glass towers that shimmered like waterfalls frozen in mid-fall, and traffic lights that blinked above strangers too busy to look each other in the eye. The address on the receipt brought him to a quiet block, tucked away from the main rush. There was no sign on the building, just a brass number next to a buzzer. He pressed it. Second Light, a voice answered crisply. I'm looking for Margot Vale, Gabe said, clearing his throat. There was a pause. Do you have an appointment? No, but I think, he swallowed. I think she might have saved my life. I just want 5 minutes. Another pause. Longer this time. Come in. Stepping into the quiet. The lobby was calm, minimal. Piano music floated gently from some unseen speaker, so faint it almost felt imagined. A woman in a sleek charcoal gray suit stepped out to greet him. Mr. Whitaker? He gave a small nod. She led him past a frosted glass door. Miss Vale rarely takes visitors, she said, but she left instructions. If anyone ever came looking for her by name, we were to let her know. Gabe's chest tightened. Why? He asked. You'll have to ask her that yourself. Face to face, Gabe meets Margot. Margot Vale sat behind a pale oak desk, surrounded by tall windows overlooking the edges of the city, where concrete gave way to trees and rooftops. She looked older than the photo he'd seen online, late 40s, maybe early 50s. But she still carried that same focused stillness, that same quiet strength. She wore no jewelry, no makeup, just a soft sweater and slacks. Her dark hair was tied back in a simple knot. In front of her sat a cup of tea, still full, untouched. When Gabe stepped into the room, she rose from her chair. "Mr. Whitaker," she said with calm recognition. He stopped in the doorway, startled. "You know who I am? I've known you since the night of the auction." His jaw tensed. "You're the one who paid for those girls." "I helped," she replied gently. "But you're the one who stepped forward when everyone else stayed still." Gabe stepped a little closer. "Why?" Margot inhaled slowly, like she was steadying herself. "Because once, when I was 7, I waited for someone who never came. I was in the foster system, and I believed, truly believed, that someone would find me. But they didn't." She looked at him. "So when I saw you, standing there, not turning away, it was like watching an old wound begin to close." He said nothing, just stood there, still as the mountains he came from, taking it in, letting it settle. Margot motioned to the chair across from her. "Please, sit." The conversation, quiet miracles. They sat across from each other for nearly an hour. Margot explained what Second Light really was. Not a brand, not a charity looking for headlines, but a quiet effort to help the ones who never asked, but still chose compassion. "I look for people like that," she said. "People who act out of instinct, not ego. You were one of them." Gabe's voice caught in his throat. "You saved us," he said, eyes shining. "More than once." But Margot shook her head gently. "No, Gabe, you saved them. I only helped carry the lantern while you found the road." Before leaving, Gabe paused in the doorway. His hand rested on the wooden frame as he looked back at her. "I always thought miracles were louder," he murmured. "Bigger somehow." Margot smiled, soft and knowing. "The real ones? They're quiet. They slip in so gently. You almost believe you did it all on your own." Then, as if it had just occurred to her, "Your daughter, Ruby, she reminds me of who I could have become if someone had found me sooner." Gabe blinked. "You remember her name?" "I remember everything," she replied. Back at the cabin, changed air. That night, when Gabe returned to the cabin, something about the air felt different. Lighter, warmer, like the whole place had breathed out while he was gone. He didn't share every detail with the kids, just said he'd met someone kind, someone who had been quietly helping them, and who believed deeply in who they were becoming. Ruby tilted her head and asked, deadpan, "Was she pretty?" Gabe chuckled. "Depends what you mean by that." The invitation, a letter with weight. A few days later, a thick ivory envelope arrived in the mail. It was sealed with gold foil and addressed in beautiful, looping handwriting, to the Whitaker family. At first, Gabe nearly tossed it, assuming it was another fundraiser or form letter. But when he opened it, he stopped cold. It was from the Regional Children's Council. Ruby Whitaker had been selected to receive the Voice of Courage Award. The ceremony would be held at the county hall. "This can't be right," Gabe said aloud, reading the letter again. Ruby peeked over his shoulder. "It's right," she said. "I am awesome." Gabe stared at her. "What?" She shrugged. "You thought I gave that lunchroom speech for free?" Getting ready, big day in May. The ceremony was set for the first Saturday in May. By then, true spring had finally touched the mountains. wildflowers unfurling from wet soil, bees tapping at the glass, and the air smelling faintly of pine and sunlight. Isla found an old sewing kit and carefully repaired the hem of her favorite dress. She was determined not to let a few stray threads spoil the moment. Theo tried on 3 different shirts before Isla helped him settle on one. It had tiny white buttons and a collar he called the itchy kind. Gabe unearthed the only jacket he owned that wasn't flannel. He hadn't worn it since Theo's baptism. It barely fit across the shoulders now, but he buttoned it anyway. When Margot heard about the award, she offered to send a tailor. "We've got what we need," Gabe replied. And he meant it. County Hall, the big night. County Hall stood tall with its white columns and broad steps. The kind of place that smelled like lemon polish, old paper, and history. Inside, the auditorium could seat 100, maybe more. That night, every seat was full. 5 of them sat in the front row. 5 chairs filled by one family. Ruby sat in the middle, swinging her feet and fiddling with the strap on her sandals. She whispered something to Theo that made him laugh hard enough to snort. Isla sat upright and quiet. Her white coat folded with care across her lap, even though she wasn't wearing it. Gabe rested his hands on his knees, shifting slightly. He was proud more than words could touch. But he'd always been more at ease fixing a pipe than being in the spotlight. Then they called Ruby's name. She rose and walked to the stage with the poise of someone far older than 6. Her dress moved lightly with each step. The same blue ribbon she'd worn on her first day of school held back her curls. The crowd clapped, warm, steady, and sincere. She took the microphone, cleared her throat, and looked right into the room. Ruby's speech, a voice that carried. "I used to think being loud made you a problem," she began. "That if you talked too much, people would stop listening. But someone told me that voices aren't meant to be quiet. They're meant to speak up, especially for people who feel too scared to say anything at all." A quiet ripple of agreement moved through the crowd. "My name is Ruby Whitaker. I'm 6, almost 7. And I used to feel really small in this world. But someone gave me a chair at the table. And now, I want to make room for someone else." The room went still. Then someone stood, clapped, then another, and another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet, applauding. Ruby smiled wide and proud. Gabe didn't clap. He couldn't. His hands were covering his mouth, trying to hide the quiet sob he hadn't expected to come. After the applause, after the event, parents and teachers gathered to offer hugs, handshakes, and congratulations. A local judge came over just to meet Ruby. Someone from the Youth Civic Board offered her a tour. Another person asked Isla if she'd be interested in visiting the children's medical lab downtown. Theo stayed close to Gabe's side, pressing softly into his leg. Gabe looked down and saw his son trembling, not from nerves, but from sensory overload. He knelt beside him, voice low, hand gentle on Theo's arm. "Hey, you okay? You okay?" Theo's signal. "You okay?" Theo didn't answer with words. He simply tapped his father's knee. One pause. One tap. "Yes." Gabe smiled. "You did good, bud. All of you did." Then he saw her. Margot returns. At the far end of the lobby, standing quietly by the tall double doors, was Margot Vale. No fanfare. No assistant trailing behind. No dramatic entrance. Just her, wearing a pale green coat, a silk scarf knotted neatly at her collar. Calm. Present. She caught Gabe's gaze and offered a quiet smile. He murmured an apology to the people around him, then stepped away, walking slowly toward her, still unsure of what, exactly, he should say. "Didn't know if you'd show up," he said softly. "Wasn't sure I should," she replied. "You belong here," Gabe said, voice certain. Margot's eyes gentled. "Thank you." There was a pause, small but full of weight. "Why us?" he asked, the question escaping before he could second-guess it. Margot glanced past him toward the refreshment table where the 3 children were laughing, bumping into one another, completely unaware of how much they'd changed the world. I didn't choose you, she said. I recognized you. She let that settle. There's a difference. Choosing means control. Recognition means fate. They stood there, letting the silence fill in the spaces where neither of them had the words. Then Gabe said something he hadn't said to anyone in over 10 years. Would you want to come by the house sometime? Margot blinked, surprised. I would. A journal entry, a lantern, and 5 seats. That night, after the kids had been tucked into bed and Gabe had hung his old coat back on its familiar nail by the door, he poured himself a mug of tea and sat at the kitchen table. He opened the leather-bound journal he never showed anyone. The one with bent corners and pages that held every quiet thought he hadn't had the nerve to say aloud. And he wrote. There were 5 seats at the front of that hall tonight. One for a girl who burns with fire. One for a girl with hands built to heal. One for a boy who's learning how to see without eyes. One for a man who forgot he was strong. And one for the woman who kept the light on. Long enough for all of us to find our way. He closed the journal slowly. Outside, the porch light flickered once. Then held steady. And something inside him, something deep and wordless, did the same. Margot's first dinner. The first time Margot Vale stayed for dinner, it was meatloaf night. Nothing fancy. No formal settings. No delicate stemware. Just a scratched-up table, mismatched chairs, chipped ceramic plates, and the familiar scent of Worcestershire and onions curling through the air. But to Gabe, it might as well have been Thanksgiving. Margot arrived carrying a basket of fresh bread, still warm, wrapped neatly in a linen towel. Wasn't sure what pairs well with meatloaf, she said as Gabe took her coat. You brought bread, he replied. You could have brought gravel and it still would have made the night better. She smiled, a quiet one, behind her reading glasses. The kids had cleaned the cabin twice over. Ruby even combed Theo's hair twice, though he'd protested both times, said it tickled too much. Isla wore her white coat like it was official uniform, proud and straight-backed. Gabe had worried the whole night might feel performative. Too staged. Too careful. But it didn't. It felt easy. Familiar. Like warmth sneaking into a house that had forgotten what it was like to be full. Conversations around the table. Dinner conversations were light but rich in color. Theo talked about his new obsession with chess. Ruby laid out her detailed plan to start a petition at school for more shelf space in the library. Isla described how her diagrams had taken over almost every wall in the hallway, especially the one just above Gabe's coat hook. Margot listened without interrupting. She didn't hover. She didn't correct. She asked questions, thoughtful, honest ones. Like someone who truly wanted to know them, not just hear them speak. Halfway through the meal, Ruby looked at her curiously. You remember all this? Margot's voice was gentle when she answered. When you've spent most of your life being forgotten. Remembering others becomes a kind of devotion. A moment on the porch, something stirring. After dessert, canned peach cobbler with instant whipped cream, Gabe stepped out onto the porch. The kids were still inside, bickering over the last spoonful. He needed air. Not because he felt uncomfortable, but because something was swelling in his chest. Memory, gratitude, maybe even joy, like a tide rising after years of stillness. Moments later, Margot joined him, folding her arms against the cool breeze. They stood there for a while, saying nothing, just watching moonlight stitch silver threads across the pine trees. She's going to change things, Gabe said after a while, nodding toward the house. Ruby. Maybe Isla too. Margot gave a small smile. They already are. He glanced over. You made that possible. No, she said with quiet certainty. You did. He leaned against the railing. Sometimes I don't feel like the man they believe I am. She looked him in the eye. They don't believe anything. They know. They live it. And the way she said it, unapologetic, unfiltered, firm. It cut through all the noise in Gabe's head. For the first time in years, he felt seen. Why us? Asked again. He turned toward her again. Why us? He asked softly, even though they'd already had that conversation. Margot turned too, her gaze steady. Because your heart said yes. Because your heart said yes. When everyone else said no. The porch light flickered the way it always did, fussy, unpredictable, then steadied. Gabe chuckled. That thing's held together with tape and a prayer. Margot looked up at it, smiling faintly. Sometimes that's all it takes. Then, gently, like it was the most natural thing in the world, she asked, "Do you ever let someone take care of you?" Gabe didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure he knew how to answer, or if he even knew the answer. "I think," he began slowly, "I've spent so long being the one who fixes everything. I forgot I might need fixing too." Margot reached across the small space between them and placed her hand over his. Not with drama, not with expectation, just enough to say, "You don't have to do it alone anymore." And somehow, that was all he needed to hear. Settling in, Margot becomes part of it. In the weeks that followed, Margot became part of the rhythm. Not every day, not so often that she disrupted the fragile cadence of their days, but just enough to weave herself into it. She showed up with groceries sometimes, or a new book tucked under her arm, a miniature microscope for Isla, a travel-sized chessboard for Theo, a leather-bound journal for Ruby with gold lettering that read, "Your voice matters," but more than the things she brought. She stayed. She ate dinner with them. She helped wash dishes. She read aloud in the evenings while the kids sprawled across the rug with homework. She never tried to replace anyone, never forced herself into a space not meant for her. She just showed up, gently, fully, steadily. A moment in May, peace like breath. One quiet afternoon in late May, Theo dozed off while Margot read from a book of fables, his head resting gently in her lap. Gabe entered the room and froze at the sight. She was brushing Theo's hair back slowly, her fingers tender, rhythmic. A gesture so full of care it nearly split something open inside him. "You know," Gabe said softly, leaning against the doorway, "he's never really slept around people. Not even me. Not when he was little." Margot didn't look up. "Then I won't move." Gabe crossed the room and sat on the floor beside her. He exhaled long and quiet, like he'd been holding his breath for years and only just remembered how to let go. "I used to think love like this happened once," he said. "And if you lost it, that was it." Margot glanced at him, her voice gentle. "It doesn't just come once. It comes when you're ready. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you're able to recognize it when it arrives." They didn't say anything else after that. No confessions. No heavy declarations. Just a stillness. Real and earned. The kind of peace that doesn't explain itself. Theo speaks, the word that meant everything. Later that night, Theo stirred in his sleep and whispered a single word. "Mama." Margot, already halfway to the door, froze. Gabe's voice was soft, odd. He's never said that before. She turned back slowly, eyes wet, blinking fast. "Then it wasn't me he meant." Gabe smiled, something warm blooming in his chest. "Maybe not. Maybe it was something he felt tonight. Safety. Belonging. Love." She lingered at the threshold a moment longer. Then, like always, she left the porch light on behind her. A season of firsts, spring ends in triumph. As the school year wound down, it brought with it a rush of firsts. Theo had his first classroom performance. He stood at the front of the room, Isla beside him, reciting a poem they'd memorized word by word together. He couldn't see the faces watching him, but he could feel the applause, warm and full like sunlight on bearskin. Ruby received her first formal invitation to join the junior speech team at the state level. Her essay, A Quiet Kid's Guide to Being Loud, had been printed in the local paper. The letters started coming in days later, dozens of them, all from adults, thanking her for saying what they hadn't known how to. Isla finished her first full anatomy model, crafted from cardboard and yarn, glue and patience. When Gabe came to pick her up from school, her teacher leaned in close and whispered, "She's the most focused child I've ever taught." A letter from Isla, a father's keepsake. But the thing that caught Gabe most off guard came one gray afternoon. Rain whispered at the windows. Isla slipped something into the pocket of his flannel shirt before heading off to make tea for Theo. "It's for you," she said simply. That night, once the house had settled and the kids were asleep, Gabe pulled out the letter and opened it under the dim light of the old corner lamp. The handwriting was small, but sure. "Dear Dad, I call you that now because it's what you are. You didn't pick us from a list. You didn't take us in because it was easy. You stepped into the fire and stayed there. And that's what makes someone a father. You didn't just give us a roof. You gave us space to become." Theo hears the world now, not with his ears, but with his hands and his heart. Ruby speaks up when it matters and listens when it counts. And me, I'm learning how to fix things. I think one day I'll fix people too, but only because you fixed something in me first. Thank you for choosing the hard thing. Thank you for staying. Thank you for teaching us how to stay too. With love, Isla. Gabe folded the letter with care, his hands shaking, not from age, but from something far more powerful. Wonder. He slipped it into the wooden box beneath his bed, right next to the other sacred pieces. The keepsakes, a box of sacred things. In the drawer beneath his bed, Gabe kept a quiet box of memories, each one a fragment of the journey they'd taken together. The receipt from the auction, Theo's very first drawing, Ruby's first petition, printed in bright markers. A single note from Margot, written in elegant, steady script. "You are the good that lasts." The next morning, Ruby's letter to the future. The next morning, Gabe stepped outside and found Ruby curled up on the porch steps, knees hugged to her chest, notebook resting against her legs. She didn't glance up when he joined her. "Another speech in the works?" he teased gently. "Not a speech," she replied, scribbling without pause. "A letter. For who?" She tilted her head slightly, eyes still on the page. "For the next kid who lives here." That caught him off guard. "Next?" he echoed. She shrugged, matter of fact. "Someday someone else might need this porch, these walls, and I want them to know they're already part of something good." Gabe reached over, mussed her hair, a soft smile tugging at his face. "You've got an old soul." "Nah," she grinned. "Just a loud one." Isla's question, a future on her mind. Later that day, Gabe was sorting tools in the shed when Isla appeared in the doorway. She wore her white coat, hands tucked behind her back. "Can I ask you something?" she said quietly. "Always." She stepped closer, uncertain. "If I get into medical school one day, and it's far away, would you be okay?" Gabe set the wrench down, crossed the shed to her, and crouched until they were eye level. "I want you to go as far as your feet, and your faith will take you," he told her. "And no matter where you land, you'll still be mine." Isla blinked, eyes stinging. "But we're not really yours." He placed his hand gently over her heart. "You are, in all the ways that count." She wrapped her arms around him without another word, burying her face in his chest. He held her for a long, long time. The guardianship letter, a new chapter begins. That evening, Margot showed up without warning. No food, no books, no small, quiet gifts, just an envelope. "This came today," she said, her voice low, but carrying something heavier than usual. Gabe opened it slowly, reading every word twice. A legal notice. Full guardianship awarded to Gabe Whitaker. For Isla. For Ruby. It was official now. No more temporary status. No more what-ifs. He looked up at her, stunned. You made this happen. Margot's eyes glistened. No, you did. Then, with a softness only certainty can give. You're family now. Gabe nodded, his throat too tight for much else. So are you. Margot hesitated just for a moment. I never really thought I'd be part of something again. You're not just part, Gabe said, taking her hand. You're woven in. A celebration by firelight. That night, they lit the fireplace for the first time, not for heat, but for joy. Ruby stood tall and read the guardianship letter like it was Shakespeare. Theo clapped so hard the sound echoed down the hallway. Isla baked cookies, too much flour, not nearly enough patience. But no one cared. Margot stayed after dinner, leaning against the kitchen doorway, watching Gabe sweep crumbs from the floor with practiced ease. You look tired, she said gently. I am, he admitted. But it's the good kind, isn't it? He turned toward her, nodding. Yeah, the kind that makes you feel alive. She stepped closer. I've been thinking, maybe this time I won't disappear. He reached for her hand. Then stay. And this time, she did. That night, a journal and a truth. Later, long after the laughter faded and the fire dimmed, Gabe opened his journal. The same one he'd been filling quietly for months. Sometimes with shaky hands, sometimes with tears he didn't let fall. And he wrote, We were strangers pulled together by circumstance. Now we're a constellation of second chances. This house used to echo with silence. Now it sings. Outside, a summer breeze moved through the trees. Inside, 5 hearts slept in harmony. And somewhere between the lives they left behind and the ones they were just beginning to build, they had created something rarer than shelter. They had built a forever. A new morning, peace in the ordinary. It started like any other morning. Birdsong slipped through the open windows. Sunlight curled softly around the curtains, as if waiting for permission to step inside. Gabe stood barefoot in the kitchen, one hand flipping pancakes, the other pouring coffee. There was a gentleness to the air, a quiet, earned kind of peace, the kind that doesn't arrive in shouts, but shows up through 1,000 small choices. Theo was the first to wander in. His steps were steady now, confident. He found the table with ease, tapped the edge twice. Yes, he was ready for breakfast. Berry mornings and familiar chaos. Maple or berry today, bud? Gabe asked, flipping another pancake. Theo grinned, then tapped twice. Berry it is, Gabe said with a nod. Solid choice. The morning rush, perfect mayhem. Moments later, Ruby stormed in mid-monologue, arms flailing as she debated aloud whether pine trees should count as architectural elements in her latest Save the Forest speech. She tossed her notebook onto the couch, grabbed a banana, and started pacing the room like a general planning her next campaign. You're giving speeches in pajamas now? Gabe teased, raising an eyebrow. Genius doesn't wait for laundry, she shot back, not missing a beat. Isla came in quietly, just as she always did. Her shirt was crisp, her stethoscope still draped around her neck, more habit than necessity now. She had a summer internship at the rural clinic and spent most of her hours shadowing nurses, gently correcting outdated terms and filing paperwork with surgical focus. Margot trailed in after her, a basket of clean laundry balanced on her hip, humming a half-familiar melody no one could name, but everyone somehow recognized. She caught Gabe's eye and smiled. No words needed. They were long past having to explain what they meant to each other. Theo's garden, the seed of something more. Later that afternoon, they all gathered near the tree line out back. Theo had asked if he could plant something, his first real garden. Nothing fancy, just a small patch for tomatoes and marigolds. They both come back, he'd said. Even if the wind knocks them down. Gabe knelt beside him, guiding his hands over the soil as they pressed seeds into the cool earth. Ruby stood nearby, proudly holding up a cardboard sign she'd painted with big, bold letters. Theo's Garden of Second Tries. Margot took a photo, not for a newsletter, not for the world. Just for them. Isla stood a little farther off, eyes lifted to where a hawk circled lazily above the pines. Do you think, she asked quietly, do you think Mom would have been proud? Gabe looked at her, really looked. She wouldn't just be proud. She'd be in awe. Not just of what you've done, but of who you've become. Because you didn't become her. You chose better. Isla nodded. No tears. Just a steadiness. Thanks for staying, she whispered. Always, he replied. Firelight and letters to tomorrow. That evening they built a fire in the backyard, not for heat, but for something deeper. Celebration. Remembrance. Gratitude. The stars began blinking to life above them, while the forest sang its soft, wordless lullaby. Margot passed out small envelopes to each of them. I thought we could try something, she said. Write a letter to your future self. Say what you want to remember, or what you never want to forget. They wrote in silence, lit by firelight, held by memory. Theo, with Isla's help, traced his message slowly. I learned to listen even when I couldn't hear. That's my superpower. Ruby's was short, loud, underlined twice. Never be quiet when the world needs your voice. And it always does. Isla's script was clean, deliberate, already taking the shape of medical charts. Even pain can lead to purpose, but only if you let love walk beside it. Margot folded hers without sharing. Some things are sacred in silence. Gabe hesitated, then looked around at the firelit circle, at a family built from scraps and survival, now glowing like stained glass. And he wrote, a man doesn't become a father the day a child is born. He becomes one the day he decides no child will be alone under his roof again. They placed the letters inside a wooden box, not to bury, but to keep. It sat now on the mantel right beside a framed photo of the 5 of them standing arm in front of the cabin. Smiles wide and honest. Gabe slipped his arm around Margot's shoulders. She rested her head against him. Do you ever wonder, he asked, what would have happened if you hadn't been there that night? At the auction? Margot shook her head gently. No, she said, because I was. And you were. And that's all that matters. He kissed the top of her head. We're not a miracle, he whispered. No, she agreed. We're what comes after the miracle, eh? The choice to live like it mattered. An open window, a still, living world. That night, just before bed, Theo turned to Gabe and asked, can I leave my window open? Sure, Gabe said, pausing at the door. Why? Theo smiled faintly. I like to listen. To the trees. To the wind. To everything that says we're still here. Gabe lingered for a moment, watching his son curl into sleep, peaceful, steady. Then he walked back into the living room. Margot was folding a blanket. Isla was scribbling notes for next week's clinic rotation. Ruby was hunched over the table, sketching out plans for a treehouse made entirely of second chances. The world, his world, was alive. Unremarkable in the best kind of way. A soft rhythm of voices, motion, and belonging. And in that quiet, ordinary hum, Gabe whispered to no one in particular. This is the everyday miracle.